In the autumn of 9 AD, 3 Roman legions vanished into the dark forests of Germania, swallowed whole by an ambush so devastating that it would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. 20,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, 3 entire legions bearing the numbers 17, 18, and 19, marched into the Teutoburg Forest and never marched out. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was annihilation so complete that Rome would never again use those legion numbers, as if the very digits themselves had been cursed by the blood spilled in those Germanic woods. The man who orchestrated this catastrophe was no barbarian chieftain screaming war cries from the wilderness. He was Arminius, a Roman citizen, a knight of the empire, educated in the halls of Rome itself. The Romans had taken him as a child, molded him in their image, taught him their language, their tactics, their weaknesses, and then they sent him home, never imagining that they had forged the instrument of their own destruction. When Emperor Augustus learned of the disaster, witnesses reported him wandering the corridors of his palace at night, beating his head against the walls and crying out in anguish, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But the legions were gone, their eagles captured, their standards trampled into the Germanic mud, their bones left to bleach in forests that would become a graveyard of Roman ambition. This is the story of how Rome's most devastating defeat was orchestrated not by foreign enemies, but by one of their own. How the empire's greatest strength, their ability to absorb and Romanize conquered peoples, became the source of their most crushing failure. The Teutoburg Forest wasn't just a battle, it was a masterpiece of deception, a trap 20 years in the making, executed with surgical precision by a man who understood Roman thinking better than the Romans themselves. The seeds of this disaster were planted decades before the first Roman boot stepped into that fatal forest. To understand how 3 veteran legions could be so thoroughly destroyed, we must first understand the man who destroyed them. Arminius wasn't born an enemy of Rome, quite the opposite. He was born around 18 BC as the eldest son of Segima, chief of the Cherusci tribe. His early childhood was spent among his people, learning the ways of the Germanic tribes, their fierce independence, their warrior culture, their deep connection to the dark forests and marshlands of northern Germania. But when Arminius was perhaps 10 years old, his world changed forever. Roman forces under Drusus crushed the Cherusci in battle, and as was Roman custom, they demanded hostages to ensure tribal compliance. Segima, faced with the choice between continued resistance and the survival of his people, made the agonizing decision that would reshape history. He surrendered both of his sons, Arminius and his younger brother Flavus, to the Romans. The practice was calculated and cruel in its effectiveness. Rome didn't simply take hostages to ensure good behavior. They took the sons of conquered nobility and transformed them into Romans. These boys would be educated in Roman schools, trained in Roman military tactics, taught Latin until they spoke it as fluently as their native tongues. They would serve in Roman legions, earn Roman citizenship, and ideally return to their homelands as loyal agents of the empire. It was cultural warfare at its most sophisticated. For Arminius, this meant years in the heart of the empire, walking the streets of Rome itself. He learned Latin not just as a foreign language, but as the tongue of power, of law, of military command. He studied Roman history, Roman philosophy, Roman military engineering. Most importantly, he learned how Romans thought, how they planned, how they fought. He absorbed their strengths and catalogued their weaknesses with the keen eye of someone who had no choice but to excel in a foreign system. The irony was breathtaking. Rome's policy of taking hostages and Romanizing them had been wildly successful for centuries. Countless tribal leaders had returned to their people as loyal Roman allies, bringing with them the benefits of Roman civilization and maintaining the peace that allowed the empire to prosper. But in Arminius, they had miscalculated catastrophically. They had taken a boy with the mind of a strategist and the heart of a patriot, and they had given him all the tools he would need to destroy them. Arminius didn't simply endure his Roman education, he excelled at it. He proved himself such a capable student and soldier that he was granted Roman citizenship, a privilege reserved for the elite. He was made an equestrian, a member of Rome's knightly class, with all the honors and responsibilities that entailed. When he served in the Roman military between 1 and 6 AD, he wasn't relegated to auxiliary units like most foreign recruits. He served alongside Roman legionaries, learning their tactics from the inside, understanding their strengths and limitations, not from the receiving end of a Roman charge, but from within the formation itself. But beneath the surface of this model Roman citizen, something else was growing. Every lesson in Roman superiority was also a lesson in Roman arrogance. Every demonstration of Roman power was also a revelation of Roman methods. Every success in Roman service was another piece of intelligence that could someday be turned against his teachers. Arminius was playing a game that would take decades to complete, and the Romans never suspected they were players rather than teachers. Meanwhile, across the Rhine in Germania, the political landscape was shifting in ways that would make Arminius's eventual betrayal not just possible, but inevitable. The Germanic territories east of the Rhine had been conquered, but never truly pacified. Roman control was maintained through a network of allied chiefs, strategic fortifications, and the ever-present threat of legionary retaliation against any tribe that stepped out of line. But conquest and control are different things, and the Romans were about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way possible. The Germanic tribes had submitted to Roman rule not out of love for Roman civilization, but out of practical necessity. They paid their taxes, provided auxiliary troops when demanded, and generally kept the peace because the alternative was destruction. But resentment simmered beneath this forced compliance, and it would take only the right combination of circumstances and leadership to transform that resentment into rebellion. Those circumstances began to align when Augustus appointed Publius Quintilius Varus as governor of Germania in 7 AD. Varus was, by all accounts, exactly the wrong man for the job at exactly the wrong time. He was a patrician of the old school, arrogant, inflexible, and utterly convinced of Roman superiority. He had previously governed Syria, where his harsh taxation and brutal punishments had earned him a reputation for ruthless efficiency. In an established Roman province, these qualities might have been assets. In Germania, they were disasters waiting to happen. Varus approached Germania as if it were simply another province to be administered rather than a collection of proud warrior peoples who had been conquered but never truly subdued. He imposed Roman law with the same heavy hand he had used in Syria, established Roman-style courts, and began extracting taxes and tribute with systematic efficiency. To the Germanic tribes, this wasn't governance. This was humiliation. Even worse, Varus seemed completely oblivious to the simmering resentment his policies were creating. He surrounded himself with Roman advisors and Germanic nobles who told him what he wanted to hear, creating an echo chamber that reinforced his belief that Germania was becoming successfully Romanized. He held court in the Roman fashion, dispensed justice according to Roman law, and generally conducted himself as if he were governing a peaceful province rather than sitting on top of a powder keg. Into this volatile situation walked Arminius, returning to Germania after years of Roman service. To Varus and his administration, Arminius appeared to be exactly what Roman policy was designed to create: a Romanized Germanic noble who could serve as a bridge between the empire and his people. He spoke perfect Latin, understood Roman customs, and had proven his loyalty through years of military service. He was, from the Roman perspective, a success story, but Arminius saw the situation very differently. He returned to find his people ground down under the weight of Roman administration, their traditional ways dismissed as barbarism, their chiefs reduced to tax collectors for a foreign power. The contrast between Roman promises of civilization and the reality of Roman rule was stark, and Arminius was uniquely positioned to see both sides clearly. More importantly, he was uniquely positioned to do something about it. His Roman education had given him not just knowledge of Roman military tactics, but understanding of Roman psychology, Roman logistics, Roman decision-making processes. He knew how Romans thought, how they planned, how they reacted to different situations. He understood their strengths, but more crucially, he understood their blind spots. And the biggest blind spot of all was their complete confidence in their own system. Romans believed that anyone who had been properly Romanized would remain loyal to Rome. The idea that someone like Arminius, educated in Roman schools, honored with Roman citizenship, proven in Roman service, could harbor not just resentment, but active plans for rebellion, was simply outside their conceptual framework. Varus never saw it coming. How could he? When Arminius appeared at his headquarters, speaking flawless Latin and offering counsel on Germanic affairs, he seemed like validation of everything Roman policy was designed to achieve. Here was living proof that Roman civilization could transform even the wildest barbarian into a loyal citizen of the empire. Varus welcomed him not just as an advisor, but as a friend. What Varus didn't understand was that he was looking at the culmination of a plan that had been years in the making. While Arminius played the role of loyal Roman ally, he was secretly moving through the Germanic tribes like a shadow, speaking in hushed tones around campfires, meeting with chiefs in hidden groves, slowly building a coalition that would have been impossible for any traditional Germanic leader to assemble. The genius of Arminius lay not just in his Roman education, but in how he used that education to solve the fundamental problem of Germanic resistance. The tribes had always been fierce warriors, but they had also always been divided. Ancient rivalries, territorial disputes, and competing loyalties had kept them fragmented, allowing Rome to play them against each other with devastating effectiveness. Previous attempts at unified rebellion had collapsed under the weight of these divisions. But Arminius understood something that traditional Germanic leaders never had. He understood that the tribes didn't need to love each other to fight together. They just needed to hate Rome more than they hated each other. And under the grinding weight of Varus's administration, that hatred was growing stronger every day. Moving carefully through the tribal networks, Arminius began weaving together the most unlikely alliance in Germanic history. The Cherusci, his own people, formed the core. But around them he gathered the Marsi, traditional enemies who shared borders and grievances. The Chatti, mountain warriors known for their ferocity. The Bructeri, masters of forest warfare. The Cherusci, whose knowledge of the marshy lowlands would prove crucial. Even elements of the Sicambri, whose previous rebellions had been crushed with typical Roman efficiency. To each tribe, Arminius spoke in their own language, both literally and figuratively. He understood their specific grievances against Roman rule, their particular strengths as warriors, their unique knowledge of local terrain. He didn't ask them to abandon their tribal identities or ancient ways. Instead, he showed them how those very traditions could become weapons against their common enemy. The Chatti knew the mountain passes where Roman formations would struggle. The Bructeri understood the forest paths where cavalry couldn't operate. The Cherusci could navigate the treacherous bogs that would swallow armored legionnaires. Separately, these advantages were interesting but limited. Together, they could create the perfect trap. But knowledge of terrain was only part of Arminius's plan. The real weapon was his understanding of Roman military psychology. He knew that Romans expected barbarians to fight like barbarians. Wild charges, screaming warriors, individual acts of heroism that could be countered by disciplined formations and superior equipment. What they didn't expect was strategic thinking that matched their own. Arminius began laying the groundwork for his trap months before the first Romans stepped into it. He studied Roman patrol patterns, supply routes, seasonal movements. He identified the perfect location for his ambush, a narrow passage where the Kalkriese hill pressed close to the Great Bog, creating a natural funnel that would compress Roman formations and eliminate their tactical advantages. More importantly, he began the delicate work of positioning his alliance for the decisive moment. Tribal warriors couldn't simply appear from nowhere without arousing suspicion. They needed reasons to be in the area, explanations that would satisfy Roman intelligence. Hunting parties moved through the forests. Trade delegations traveled along established routes. Religious gatherings drew people from across the region. Each movement was carefully orchestrated, each presence justified, but together they created the largest concentration of Germanic warriors the region had seen in generations. Meanwhile, Arminius continued his performance as the loyal Roman ally. He attended Varus's councils, offered advice on tribal affairs, and generally made himself indispensable to the Roman administration. His insights into Germanic thinking were valued precisely because they seemed to come from someone who had successfully bridged both worlds. When he warned of tribal unrest, Varus listened. When he suggested diplomatic solutions, Varus nodded approvingly. When he offered to serve as intermediary with difficult chiefs, Varus was grateful. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Arminius understood that the best way to control someone wasn't to oppose their plans, but to shape them. He didn't need to convince Varus to march into the Teutoburg Forest. He just needed to create circumstances where that march would seem like Varus's own idea, the logical response to a situation that demanded Roman intervention. The final piece of his trap was perhaps the most audacious. Arminius needed to get 3 full legions, along with their auxiliary forces and camp followers, to abandon their planned route to winter quarters and instead take a detour through some of the most difficult terrain in Germania. This couldn't appear to be his suggestion. It had to seem like military necessity. So Arminius fabricated a rebellion, not a real uprising that might spiral out of control, but a carefully crafted fiction that would demand exactly the response he wanted. Reports began filtering back to Varus of unrest among distant tribes, probably the Angrivarii to the northwest. Nothing too serious, but significant enough to require attention. The timing was perfect, just as the legions were preparing for their autumn march to winter quarters. The beauty of the deception was that it played directly into Roman assumptions about Germanic behavior. Of course, the tribes were restless. They always were. Of course, they would choose the worst possible moment to cause trouble. That was exactly the kind of short-sighted thinking Romans expected from barbarians. And of course, the situation would require Roman intervention to prevent it from spreading. When Arminius suggested that Varus could deal with this minor rebellion while simultaneously returning to winter quarters by taking a slightly different route, it seemed like elegant efficiency. Why make 2 separate trips when one would suffice? The detour would take them along the northern edge of the Weser Hills, through the Teutoburg Forest where the highlands descended toward the North European plain. The terrain would be challenging, but Roman engineering could handle it. After all, Roman roads had been built through far worse. Varus accepted the plan without hesitation. From his perspective, it made perfect military and administrative sense. He would demonstrate Roman power to potentially troublesome tribes, resolve the uprising quickly and decisively, and still make it to winter quarters on schedule. The fact that his most trusted Germanic advisor had suggested the route only made it more appealing. What Varus didn't know was that he had just agreed to march 3 legions directly into the most perfectly prepared ambush in military history. Every aspect of his route had been studied, every potential Roman response anticipated, every escape route blocked. The Germanic warriors who would spring the trap had been positioned with surgical precision, their roles rehearsed, their coordination planned down to the smallest detail. The irony was devastating. Rome's greatest military disaster would be orchestrated using Roman methods by a Roman-educated enemy who understood Roman thinking better than most Romans. The empire that prided itself on turning barbarians into civilized allies had instead created the architect of its own destruction. As summer faded into autumn, the pieces of Arminius's trap were falling into place. The legions were preparing for their march. The Germanic warriors were moving into position, and Varus, confident in his loyal advisor and his own military superiority, was about to lead 20,000 Roman soldiers into a forest from which almost none would return. The march began in early September of 9 AD, as 3 Roman legions prepared to leave their summer camps west of the river Weser. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions represented some of Rome's finest fighting forces, veterans who had campaigned across the empire from the deserts of Africa to the mountains of Spain. These were not green recruits or hastily raised auxiliaries. These were professional soldiers, hardened by years of service, disciplined by countless hours of drill, and equipped with the finest weapons and armor the ancient world could produce. But as they formed up in their marching columns that crisp September morning, they were already walking dead men. They just didn't know it yet. Varus rode at the head of his command, resplendent in his scarlet cloak and polished bronze armor, every inch the Roman general. Behind him stretched a column that seemed to go on forever. 3 full legions meant roughly 15,000 legionnaires, but that was only the beginning. Add the auxiliary cohorts, Germanic allies who served Rome for pay and citizenship, bringing the military strength to nearly 20,000 fighting men. Then came the cavalry squadrons, their horses snorting in the cool morning air, riders checking their gear one final time. Yet this wasn't just an army on the march. It was a mobile community, a slice of Roman civilization moving through hostile territory. Behind the soldiers came the baggage trains, countless wagons loaded with supplies, equipment, and the accumulated wealth of a successful campaign season. Engineers traveled with their tools and surveying equipment. Merchants followed the legions like vultures, ready to profit from conquest or disaster. Camp followers of every description tagged along, from the wives and children of veteran soldiers to the slaves and servants who kept the army functioning. The column stretched for miles, a river of humanity flowing through the Germanic wilderness. In open country, such a formation would have been magnificent, a demonstration of Roman power that could cow any enemy into submission. But they weren't marching through open country. They were heading into the Teutoburg Forest, where the very qualities that made them formidable would become liabilities. Arminius rode alongside Varus, playing his role to perfection. He pointed out landmarks, offered commentary on the local tribes, and generally made himself useful as both guide and advisor. To any observer, he appeared exactly what he claimed to be, a Romanized Germanic noble helping his Roman friends navigate his homeland. His performance was flawless, because in many ways it wasn't a performance at all. He genuinely understood Roman thinking, genuinely appreciated Roman achievements, and genuinely respected many of the men he was about to betray. But respect and loyalty are different things, and Arminius had made his choice years ago. As he chatted with Roman officers, laughed at their jokes, and shared their wine, part of his mind was calculating distances, timing the column's progress, and sending subtle signals to watchers hidden in the forest. Every mile they marched took them deeper into his trap, further from safety, closer to their doom. The weather began to deteriorate almost immediately. What had started as a pleasant autumn day gave way to grey skies and intermittent rain. The carefully maintained Roman roads they were accustomed to traveling gave way to rough Germanic tracks that turned muddy under the wheels of heavy wagons. Progress slowed as drivers struggled to keep their vehicles moving through increasingly difficult terrain. For the Roman soldiers, this was merely an inconvenience. They had marched through worse weather, over worse ground, in campaigns across the empire. A little mud and rain were hardly enough to concern veterans who had fought in the scorching heat of Arabia and the freezing mountains of Armenia. They grumbled good-naturedly, made jokes about Germanic hospitality, and pressed on with the stoic endurance that was the hallmark of Roman discipline. What they didn't understand was that every delay, every moment spent struggling with bogged-down wagons or treacherous footing, was buying time for their enemies. In the forests around them, Germanic warriors were moving into position with the patience of born hunters. They knew these woods like Romans knew the streets of their hometowns, could move through them in conditions that would leave legionnaires lost and helpless. The Cherusci had taken positions along the planned route, but they weren't alone. Arminius's coalition had grown beyond even his most optimistic projections. Word of the coming ambush had spread through the tribal networks like wildfire, drawing warriors who wanted to strike a blow against Roman oppression. Young men seeking glory, veterans nursing old grievances, entire warbands eager to prove their courage against the empire's finest troops. But this wasn't a mob of howling barbarians preparing to charge Roman shields. Arminius had spent months drilling his forces, teaching them patience, coordination, the importance of timing. He understood that Germanic warriors' greatest weakness was their tendency toward individual heroics, their desire to win personal glory even at the cost of tactical advantage. Against Roman discipline, such behavior was suicidal. Instead, he had created something new in Germanic warfare, a force that combined tribal ferocity with strategic thinking learned in Roman schools. His warriors knew their roles, understood the plan, and had been positioned with surgical precision. The Chatti held the high ground along the Kalkriese hill, their knowledge of mountain fighting perfectly suited to harassing enemies from above. The Bructeri controlled the forest paths, ready to emerge from concealment and strike at Roman flanks before melting back into the trees. The Cherusci guarded the approaches to the Great Bog, ensuring that any Romans who tried to escape in that direction would find only death in the treacherous marshes. Most importantly, Arminius had prepared fallback positions, secondary ambush sites, and contingency plans for every possible Roman response. He knew how legions deployed when attacked, how they formed defensive squares, how they tried to fight their way out of encirclement. Every Roman tactical manual had been studied, every standard procedure anticipated, every likely response counted before it could be attempted. As the first day of marching wore on, and the Roman column struggled through increasingly difficult terrain, Germanic scouts shadowed their movement from just beyond sight. These weren't the wild-haired barbarians of Roman imagination, but careful professionals who reported the column's composition, speed, and condition with military precision. Runners carried their intelligence back to Arminius, who used it to fine-tune his preparations and adjust his warriors' positions. The Romans, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the danger closing around them. Their own scouts, mostly Germanic auxiliaries whose loyalty Arminius had long since subverted, reported nothing unusual. A few hunters in the distance, perhaps some traders moving along forest paths. Certainly nothing that looked like military preparation. The deception was complete, the trap invisible until it was too late to escape. The Teutoburg Forest stands as history's greatest lesson in the danger of underestimating one's enemies. 3 legions, 20,000 men, vanished not because Rome was weak, but because they were blind to the very real threat of their own arrogance. Arminius didn't just defeat an army that September day. He shattered an empire's confidence and proved that even the mightiest civilizations can fall to those they seek to control.